stations and I began to get uneasy, so I kept my back to him and said firmly, "Thank you for bringing up my suitcase." "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "Ha," he said in a very nasty insinuating tone, and before I could wheel round to see what had come over him he was gone, shutting the door behind him with a rude slam. Later, when I told Doreen about his curious behavior, Ski said, "You ninny, he wanted his tip." I asked how much I should have given and she said a quarter at least and 35 cents if the suitcase was too heavy. Now I could have carried that suitcase to my room perfectly well by myself, only the bellhop seemed so eager to do it that I let him. I thought that sort of service came along with what you paid for your hotel room. I hate handing over money to people for doing what I could just as easily do myself, it makes me nervous. Doreen said 10% was what you should tip a person, but I somehow never had the right change and I'd have felt awfully silly giving somebody half a dollar and saying, 15 cents of this is a tip for you, please give me 35 cents back. The first time I took a taxi in New York I tipped the driver 10 cents. The fare was $1, so I thought 10 cents was exactly right and gave the driver my dime with a little flourish and a smile. But he only held it in the palm of his hand and stared at it, and when I stepped out of the cab, hoping I had not handed him a Canadian dime by mistake, he started yelling, "Lady, I gotta live like you and everybody else," in a loud voice which scared me so much I broke into a run. Luckily he was stopped at a traffic light or I think he would have driven along beside me yelling in that embarrassing way. When I asked Doreen about this she said the tipping percentage might well have risen from 10 to 15% since she was last in New York. Either that, or that particular cab driver was an out-and-out louse. I reached for the book the people from Ladies' Day had sent. When I opened it a card fell out. The front of the card showed a poodle in a flowered bed jacket sitting in a poodle basket with a sad face, and the inside of the card showed the poodle lying down in the basket with a smile, sound asleep under an embroidered sampler that said, "You'll get well best with lots and lots of rest." At the bottom of the card somebody had written, "Get well quick. From all of your good friends at Ladies' Day," in lavender ink. I flipped through one story after another until finally I came to a story about a fig tree. This fig grew on a green lawn between the house of a Jewish man and a convent, and the Jewish man and a beautiful dark nun kept meeting at the tree to pick the ripe figs, until one day they saw an egg hatching in a bird's nest on a branch of the tree, and as they watched the little bird peck its way out of the egg, they touched the backs of their hands together. And then the nun didn't come out to pick figs with the Jewish man anymore but a mean-faced Catholic kitchen maid came to pick them instead and counted up the figs the man picked after they were both through to be sure he hadn't picked any more than she had, and the man was furious. I thought it was a lovely story, especially the part about the fig tree in winter under the snow and then the fig tree in spring with all the green fruit. I felt sorry when I came to the last page. I wanted to crawl in between those black lines of print the way you crawl through a fence, and go to sleep under that beautiful big green fig tree. It seemed to me Buddy Willard and I were like that Jewish man and that nun, although of course we weren't Jewish or Catholic but Unitarian. We had met together under our own imaginary fig tree, and what we had seen wasn't a bird coming out of an egg but a baby coming out of a woman, and then something awful happened and we went our separate ways. As I lay there in my white hotel bed feeling lonely and weak, I thought I was up in that sanatorium in the Adirondacks, and I felt like a heel of the worst sort. In his letters Buddy kept telling me how he was reading poems by a poet who was also a doctor and how he'd found out about some famous dead Russian short story writer who had been a doctor too, so maybe doctors and writers could get along fine after all. Now this was a very different tune from what Buddy Willard had been singing all the 2 years we were getting to know each other. I remember the day he smiled at me and said, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I said. "A piece of dust." And he looked so proud of having thought of this that I just stared at his blonde hair and his blue eyes and his white teeth. He had very long, strong teeth and said, "I guess so." It was only in the middle of New York a whole year later that I finally thought of an answer to that remark. I spent a lot of time having imaginary conversations with Buddy Willard. He was a couple of years older than I was and very scientific, so he could always prove things. When I was with him I had to work to keep my head above water. These conversations I had in my mind usually repeated the beginnings of conversations I'd really had with Buddy, only they finished with me answering him back quite sharply, instead of just sitting around and saying, "I guess so." Now, lying on my back in bed, I imagine Buddy saying, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I would say. "A piece of dust." Then just as he was smiling and starting to look proud, I would say, "So are the cadavers you cut up. So are the people you think you're curing. They're dust as dust as dust." I reckon a good poem lasts a whole lot longer than 100 of those people put together. And of course Buddy wouldn't have any answer to that, because what I said was true. People were made of nothing so much as dust, and I couldn't see that doctoring all that dust was a bit better than writing poems people would remember and repeat to themselves when they were unhappy or sick and couldn't sleep. My trouble was I took everything Buddy Willard told me as the honest-to-God truth. I remember the first night he kissed me. It was after the Yale Junior Prom. It was strange, the way Buddy had invited me to that prom. He popped into my house out of the blue one Christmas vacation, wearing a thick white turtleneck sweater and looking so handsome I could hardly stop staring, and said, "I might drop over to see you at college someday, all right?" I was flabbergasted. I only saw Buddy at church on Sundays when we were both home from college, and then at a distance, and I couldn't figure what had put it into his head to run over and see me. He had run the 2 miles between our houses for cross-country practice, he said. Of course, our mothers were good friends. They had gone to school together and then both married their professors and settled down in the same town, but Buddy was always off on a scholarship at prep school in the fall or earning money by fighting blister rust in Montana in the summer, so our mothers being old school chums really didn't matter a bit. After this sudden visit I didn't hear a word from Buddy until one fine Saturday morning in early March. I was up in my room at college, studying about Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless for my history exam on the Crusades the coming Monday, when the hall phone rang. Usually people are supposed to take turns answering the hall phone, but as I was the only freshman on a floor with all seniors they made me answer it most of the time. I waited a minute to see if anybody would beat me to it. Then I figured everybody was probably out playing squash or away on weekends, so I answered it myself. "Is that you, Esther?" the girl on watch downstairs said, and when I said yes, she said, "There's a man to see you." I was surprised to hear this, because of all the blind dates I'd had. That You're Not One called me up again for a second date. I just didn't have any luck. I hated coming downstairs sweaty-handed and curious every Saturday night and having some senior introduce me to her aunt's best friend's son and finding some pale, mushroomy fellow with protruding ears or buck teeth or a bad leg. I didn't think I deserved it. After all, I wasn't crippled in any way, I just studied too hard, I didn't know when to stop. Well, I combed my hair and put on some more lipstick and took my history book so I could say I was on my way to the library if it turned out to be somebody awful, and went down, and there was Buddy Willard leaning against the mail table in a khaki zipper jacket and blue dungarees and frayed gray sneakers and grinning up at me. "I just came over to say hello," he said. I thought it odd he should come all the way up from Yale even hitchhiking. As he did, to save money, just to say hello. "Hello," I said. "Let's go out and sit on the porch." I wanted to go out on the porch because the girl on watch was a nosy senior and eyeing me curiously. She obviously thought Buddy had made a big mistake. We sat side by side in 2 wicker rocking chairs. The sunlight was clean and windless and almost hot. "I can't stay for more than a few minutes," Buddy said. "Oh, come on, stay for lunch," I said. "Oh, I can't do that. I'm up here for the sophomore prom with Joan." I felt like a prize idiot. "How is Joan?" I asked coldly. Joan Gillen came from our hometown and went to our church and was a year ahead of me at college. She was a big wheel president of her class and a physics major and the college hockey champion. She always made me feel squirmy with her starry pebble-colored eyes and her gleaming tombstone teeth and her breathy voice. She was big as a horse, too. I began to think Buddy had pretty poor taste. "Oh, Joan," he said. "She asked me up to this dance 2 months ahead of time and her mother asked my mother if I would take her, so what could I do?" "Well, why did you say you'd take her if you didn't want to?" I asked meanly. "Oh, I like Joan. She never cares whether you spend any money on her or not and she enjoys doing things out of doors. The last time she came down to Yale for house weekend we went on a bicycle trip to East Rock and she's the only girl I haven't had to push up hills. Joan's all right." I went cold with envy. I had never been to Yale, and Yale was the place all the seniors in my house liked to go best on weekends. I decided to expect nothing from Buddy Willard. If you expect nothing from somebody you are never disappointed. "You better go and find Joan then," I said in a matter-of-fact voice. "I've a date coming any minute and he won't like seeing me sitting around with you." "A date?" Buddy looked surprised. "Who is it?" "It's two," I said, "Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless." Buddy didn't say anything, so I said, "Those are their nicknames." Then I added, "They're from Dartmouth." I guess Buddy never read much history, because his mouth stiffened. He swung up from the wicker rocking chair and gave it a sharp little unnecessary push. Then he dropped a pale blue envelope with a Yale crest into my lap. "Here's a letter I meant to leave for you if you weren't in. There's a question in it you can answer by mail. I don't feel like asking you about it right now." After Buddy had gone I opened the letter. It was a letter inviting me to the Yale Junior Prom. I was so surprised I let out a couple of yips and ran into the house shouting, I'm going, I'm going, I'm going." After the bright white sun on the porch it looked pitch dark in there, and I couldn't make out a thing. I found myself hugging the senior on watch. When she heard I was going to the Yale Junior Prom she treated me with amazement and respect. Oddly enough, things changed in the house after that. The seniors on my floor started speaking to me and every now and then one of them would answer the phone quite spontaneously and nobody made any more nasty loud remarks outside my door about people wasting their golden college days with their noses stuck in a book. Well, all during the junior prom Buddy treated me like a friend or a cousin. We danced about a mile apart the whole time, until during Auld Lang Syne he suddenly rested his chin on the tip of my head as if he were very tired. Then in the cold, black, 3 o'clock wind we walked very slowly the 5 miles back to the house where I was sleeping in the living room on a couch that was too short because it only cost 50 cents a night instead of $2 like most of the other places with proper beds. I felt dull and flat and full of shattered visions. I had imagined Buddy would fall in love with me that weekend and that I wouldn't have to worry about what I was doing on any more Saturday nights the rest of the year. Just as we approached the house where I was staying Buddy said, "Let's go up to the chemistry lab." I was aghast. "The chemistry lab?" "Yes." Buddy reached for my hand. "There's a beautiful view up there behind the chemistry lab." And sure enough, there was a sort of hilly place behind the chemistry lab from which you could see the lights of a couple of houses in New Haven. I stood pretending to admire them while Buddy got a good footing on the rough soil. While he kissed me I kept my eyes open and tried to memorize the spacing of the house lights so I would never forget them. Finally Buddy stepped back. "Wow," he said. "Wow what?" I said, surprised. It had been a dry, uninspiring little kiss, and I remember thinking it was too bad both our mouths were so chapped from walking 5 miles in that cold wind. "Wow, it makes me feel terrific to kiss you." I modestly didn't say anything. "I guess you go out with a lot of boys," Buddy said then. "Well, I guess I do. I thought I must have gone out with a different boy for every week in the year." "Well, I have to study a lot." "So do I put in hastily. I have to keep my scholarship after all. Still, I think I could manage to see you every third weekend. That's nice. I was almost fainting and dying to get back to college. And tell everybody. Buddy kissed me again in front of the house steps, in the next fall. When his scholarship to medical school came through, I went there to see him instead of to Yale, and it was there I found out how he had fooled me all those years and what a hypocrite he was. I found out on the day we saw the baby born. 6. I had kept begging Buddy to show me some really interesting hospital sites, so one Friday I cut all my classes and came down for a long weekend, and he gave me the works. I started out by dressing in a white coat and sitting on a tall stool. In a room with 4 cadavers, while Buddy and his friends cut them up. These cadavers were so unhuman looking they didn't bother me a bit. They had stiff, leathery, purple-black skin and they smelt like old pickle jars. After that, Buddy took me out into the hall where they had some big glass bottles full of babies that had died before they were born. The baby in the first bottle had a large white head bent over a tiny curled-up body the size of a frog. The baby in the next bottle was bigger and the baby next to that one was bigger still, and the baby in the last bottle was the size of a normal baby, and he seemed to be looking at me and smiling a little piggy smile. I was quite proud of the calm way I stared at all these gruesome things. The only time I jumped was when I leaned my elbow on Buddy's cadaver's stomach to watch him dissect a lung. After a minute or two I felt this burning sensation in my elbow, and it occurred to me the cadaver might just be half alive since it was still warm, so I leapt off my stool with a small exclamation. Then Buddy explained the burning was only from the pickling fluid, and I sat back in my old position. In the hour before lunch Buddy took me to a lecture on sickle cell anemia and some other depressing diseases, where they wheeled sick people out onto the platform and asked them questions, and then wheeled them off and showed colored slides. One slide I remember showed a beautiful laughing girl with a black mole on her cheek. 20 days after that mole appeared the girl was dead, the doctor said, and everybody went very quiet for a minute and then the bell rang, so I never really found out what the mole was or why the girl died. In the afternoon we went to see a baby born. First we found a linen closet in the hospital corridor where Buddy took out a white mask for me to wear and some gauze. A tall fat medical student, big as Sydney Greenstreet, lounged nearby, watching Buddy wind the gauze round and round my head until my hair was completely covered and only my eyes peered out over the white mask. The medical student gave an unpleasant little snicker. "At least your mother loves you," he said. I was so busy thinking how very fat he was and how unfortunate it must be for a man and especially a young man to be fat, because what woman could stand leaning over that big stomach to kiss him, that I didn't immediately realize what this student had said to me was an insult. By the time I figured he must consider himself quite a fine fellow and had thought up a cutting remark about how only a mother loves a fat man, he was gone. Buddy was examining a queer wooden plaque on the wall with a row of holes in it, starting from a hole about the size of a silver dollar and ending with one the size of a dinner plate. "Fine, fine," he said to me. "There's somebody about to have a baby. This minute." At the door of the delivery room stood a thin, stoop-shouldered medical student Buddy knew. "Hello, Will," Buddy said. "Who's on the job?" "I am," Will said gloomily, and I noticed little drops of sweat beading his high pale forehead. "I am, and it's my first." Buddy told me Will was a third-year man and had to deliver 8 babies before he could graduate. Then he noticed a bustle at the far end of the hall and some men in lime green coats and skullcaps and a few nurses came moving toward us in a ragged procession wheeling a trolley with a big white lump on it. "You oughtn't to see this," Will muttered in my ear. "You'll never want to have a baby if you do. They oughtn't to let women watch. It'll be the end of the human race." Buddy and I laughed, and then Buddy shook Will's hand and we all went into the room. I was so struck by the sight of the table where they were lifting the woman I didn't say a word. It looked like some awful torture table, with these metal stirrups sticking up in mid-air at one end and all sorts of instruments and wires and tubes I couldn't make out properly at the other. Buddy and I stood together by the window, a few feet away from the woman, where we had a perfect view. The woman's stomach stuck up so high I couldn't see her face or the upper part of her body at all. She seemed to have nothing but an enormous spider-fat stomach and two little ugly spindly legs propped in the high stirrups, and all the time the baby was being born she never stopped making this unhuman hooing noise. Later Buddy told me the woman was on a drug that would make her forget she'd had any pain, and that when she swore and groaned she really didn't know what she was doing because she was in a kind of twilight sleep. I thought it sounded just like the sort of drug a man would invent. Here was a woman in terrible pain, obviously feeling every bit of it, or she wouldn't groan like that, and she would go straight home and start another baby, because the drug would make her forget how bad the pain had been, when all the time, in some secret part of her, that long, blind, doorless and windowless corridor of pain was waiting to open up and shut her in again. The head doctor, who was supervising Will, kept saying to the woman, "Push down, Mrs. Tomalillo, push down, that's a good girl, push down," and finally through the split, shaven place between her legs, lurid with disinfectant, I saw a dark fuzzy thing appear. "The baby's head," Buddy whispered under cover of the woman's groans. But the baby's head stuck for some reason, and the doctor told Will he'd have to make a cut. I heard the scissors close on the woman's skin like cloth, and the blood began to run down a fierce, bright red. Then all at once the baby seemed to pop out into Will's hands, the color of a blue Pluto and flowered with white stuff and streaked with blood, and Will kept saying, "I'm going to drop it, I'm going to drop it, I'm going to drop it," in a terrified voice. "No, you're not," the doctor said, and took the baby out of Will's hands and started massaging it, and the blue color went away and the baby started to cry in a torn, croaky voice, and I could see it was a boy. The first thing that baby did was pee in the doctor's face. I told Buddy later I didn't see how that was possible, but he said it was quite possible, though unusual, to see something like that happen. As soon as the baby was born, the people in the room divided up into two groups, the nurses tying a metal dog tag on the baby's wrist and swabbing its eyes with cotton on the end of a stick and wrapping it up and putting it in a canvas-sided cot, while the doctor and Will started sewing up the woman's cut with a needle and a long thread. I think somebody said, "It's a boy, Mrs. Tomalillo," but the woman didn't answer or raise her head. "Well, how was it?" Buddy asked with a satisfied expression as we walked across the green quadrangle to his room. "Wonderful," I said. I could see something like that every day. I didn't feel up to asking him if there were any other ways to have babies. For some reason the most important thing to me was actually seeing the baby come out of you yourself and making sure it was yours. I thought if you had to have all that pain anyway, you might just as well stay awake. I had always imagined myself hitching up onto my elbows on the delivery table after it was all over, dead white, of course, with no makeup and from the awful ordeal, but smiling and radiant, with my hair down to my waist, and reaching out for my first little squirmy child and saying its name, whatever it was. Why was it all covered with flour? I asked then, to keep the conversation going, and Buddy told me about the waxy staff that guarded the baby's skin. When we were back in Buddy's room, which reminded me of nothing so much as a monk's cell, with its bare walls and bare bed and bare floor and the desk loaded with Gray's Anatomy and other thick gruesome books, Buddy lit a candle and uncorked a bottle of Dubonnet. Then we lay down side by side on the bed and Buddy sipped his wine while I read aloud Somewhere I Have Never Traveled and other poems from a book I'd brought. Buddy said he figured there must be something in poetry if a girl like me spent all her days over it, so each time we met I read him some poetry and explained to him what I found in it. It was Buddy's idea. He always arranged our weekends so we'd never regret wasting our time in any way. Buddy's father was a teacher, and I think Buddy could have been a teacher as well. He was always trying to explain things to me and introduce me to new knowledge. Suddenly, after I finished a poem, he said, "Esther, have you ever seen a man?" The way he said it I knew he didn't mean a regular man or a man in general. I knew he meant a man naked. No, I said. Only statues. Well, don't you think you would like to see me? I didn't know what to say. My mother and my grandmother had started hinting around to me a lot lately about what a fine, clean boy Buddy Willard was, coming from such a fine, clean family, and how everybody at church thought he was a model person, so kind to his parents and to older people, as well as so athletic and so handsome and so intelligent. All I'd heard about, really, was how fine and clean Buddy was and how he was the kind of a person a girl should stay fine and clean for. So I didn't really see the harm in anything Buddy would think up to do. Well, all right, I guess so, I said. I stared at Buddy while he unzipped his chino pants and took them off and laid them on a chair and then took off his underpants that were made of something like nylon fishnet. They're cool, he explained, and my mother says they wash easily. Then he just stood there in front of me and I kept staring at him. The only thing I could think of was turkey neck and turkey gizzards, and I felt very depressed. Buddy seemed hurt I didn't say anything. I think you ought to get used to me like this, he said. Now let me see you. But undressing in front of Buddy suddenly appealed to me about as much as having my posture picture taken at college, where you have to stand naked in front of a camera, knowing all the time that a picture of you stark naked, both full view and side view, is going into the college gym files to be marked A, B, C, or D depending on how straight you are. Oh, some other time, I said. All right. Buddy got dressed again. Then we kissed and hugged a while and I felt a little better. I drank the rest of the Dubonnet and sat cross-legged at the end of Buddy's bed and asked for a comb. I began to comb my hair down over my face so Buddy couldn't see it. Suddenly I said, "Have you ever had an affair with anyone, Buddy?" I don't know what made me say it, the words just popped out of my mouth. I never thought for 1 minute that Buddy Willard would have an affair with anyone. I expected him to say, "No, I have been saving myself for when I get married to somebody pure and a virgin like you." But Buddy didn't say anything, he just turned pink. Well, have you? What do you mean, an affair? Buddy asked then in a hollow voice. You know, have you ever gone to bed with anyone? I kept rhythmically combing the hair down over the side of my face nearest to Buddy, and I could feel the little electric filaments clinging to my hot cheeks and I wanted to shout, "Stop, stop, don't tell me, don't say anything." But I didn't, I just kept still. Well, yes, I have, Buddy said finally. I almost fell over. From the first night Buddy Willard kissed me and said I must go out with a lot of boys, he made me feel I was much more sexy and experienced than he was and that everything he did like hugging and kissing and petting was simply what I made him feel like doing out of the blue, he couldn't help it and didn't know how it came about. Now I saw he had only been pretending all this time to be so innocent. Tell me about it. I combed my hair slowly over and over, feeling the teeth of the comb dig into my cheek at every stroke. Who was it? Buddy seemed relieved I wasn't angry. He even seemed relieved to have somebody to tell about how he was seduced. Of course, somebody had seduced Buddy, Buddy hadn't started it and it wasn't really his fault. It was this waitress at the hotel he worked at as a busboy the last summer at Cape Cod. Buddy had noticed her staring at him queerly and shoving her breasts up against him in the confusion of the kitchen, so finally one day he asked her what the trouble was and she looked him straight in the eye and said, "I want you." Served up with parsley? Buddy had laughed innocently. No, she had said. Some night. And that's how Buddy had lost his pureness and his virginity. At first I thought he must have slept with the waitress only the once. But when I asked how many times, just to make sure, he said he couldn't remember but a couple of times a week for the rest of the summer. I multiplied 3 by 10 and got 30, which seemed beyond all reason. After that something in me just froze up. Back at college I started asking a senior here and a senior there what they would do if a boy they knew suddenly told them he'd slept 30 times with some slutty waitress one summer, smack in the middle of knowing them. but these seniors said most boys were like that and you couldn't honestly accuse them of anything until you were at least pinned or engaged to be married. Actually, it wasn't the idea of Buddy sleeping with somebody that bothered me. I mean, I'd read about all sorts of people sleeping with each other, and if it had been any other boy I would merely have asked him the most interesting details, and maybe gone out and slept with somebody myself just to even things up, and then thought no more about it. What I couldn't stand was Buddy's pretending I was so sexy and he was so pure, when all the time he'd been having an affair with that tardy waitress and must have felt like laughing in my face. "What does your mother think about this waitress?" I asked Buddy that weekend. Buddy was amazingly close to his mother. He was always quoting what she said about the relationship between a man and a woman, and I knew Mrs. Willard was a real fanatic about virginity for men and women both. When I first went to her house for supper she gave me a queer, shrewd, searching look, and I knew she was trying to tell whether I was a virgin or not. Just as I thought, Buddy was embarrassed. "Mother asked me about Gladys," he admitted. "Well, what did you say?" I said Gladys was free, white and 21. Now I knew Buddy would never talk to his mother as rudely as that for my sake. He was always saying how his mother said, "What a man wants is a mate and what a woman wants is infinite security," and, "What a man is an arrow into the future and what a woman is the place the arrow shoots off from," until it made me tired. Every time I tried to argue, Buddy would say his mother still got pleasure out of his father and wasn't that wonderful for people their age, it must mean she really knew what was what. Well, I had just decided to ditch Buddy Willard for once and for all, not because he'd slept with that waitress but because he didn't have the honest guts to admit it straight off to everybody and face up to it as part of his character, when the phone in the hall rang and somebody said in a little knowing sing-song, "It's for you, Esther, it's from Boston." I could tell right away something must be wrong, because Buddy was the only person I knew in Boston, and he never called me long distance because it was so much more expensive than letters. Once, when he had a message he wanted me to get almost immediately, he went all round his entry at medical school asking if anybody was driving up to my college that weekend, and sure enough, somebody was, so he gave them a note for me and I got it the same day. He didn't even have to pay for a stamp. It was Buddy all right. He told me that the annual fall chest x-ray showed he had caught TB and he was going off on a scholarship for medical students who caught TB to a TB place in the Adirondacks. Then he said I hadn't written since that last weekend and he hoped nothing was the matter between us, and would I please try to write him at least once a week and come to visit him at this TB place in my Christmas vacation? I had never heard Buddy so upset. He was very proud of his perfect health and was always telling me it was psychosomatic when my sinuses blocked up and I couldn't breathe. I thought this an odd attitude for a doctor to have and perhaps he should study to be a psychiatrist instead, but of course I never came right out and said so. I told Buddy how sorry I was about the TB and promised to write, but when I hung up I didn't feel one bit sorry. I only felt a wonderful relief. I thought the TB might just be a punishment for living the kind of double life Buddy lived and feeling so superior to people. And I thought how convenient it would be now I didn't have to announce to everybody at college I had broken off with Buddy and start the boring business of blind dates all over again. I simply told everyone that Buddy had TB and we were practically engaged, and when I stayed in to study on Saturday nights they were extremely kind to me because they thought I was so brave, working the way I did just to hide a broken heart. 7. Of course, Constantine was much too short, but in his own way he was handsome, with light brown hair and dark blue eyes and a lively, challenging expression. He could almost have been an American, he was so tan and had such good teeth, but I could tell straight away that he wasn't. He had what no American man I've ever met has had, and that's intuition. From the start Constantine guessed I wasn't any protégé of Mrs. Willard's. I raised an eyebrow here and dropped a dry little laugh there, and pretty soon we were both openly raking Mrs. Willard over the coals and I thought, this Constantine won't mind if I'm too tall and don't know enough languages and haven't been to Europe, he'll see through all that stuff to what I really am. Constantine drove me to the UN in his old green convertible with cracked, comfortable brown leather seats and the top down. He told me his tan came from playing tennis, and when we were sitting there side by side flying down the streets in the open sun, he took my hand and squeezed it, and I felt happier than I had been since I was about 9 and running along the hot white beaches with my father the summer before he died. And while Constantine and I sat in one of those hushed plush auditoriums in the UN, next to a stern muscular Russian girl with no makeup who was a simultaneous interpreter like Constantine, I thought how strange it had never occurred to me before that I was only purely happy until I was 9 years old. After that, in spite of the Girl Scouts and the piano lessons and the watercolor lessons and the dancing lessons and the sailing camp, all of which my mother scrimped to give me, and college, with crowing in the mist before breakfast and black-bottom pies and the little new firecrackers of ideas going off every day, I had never been really happy again. I stared through the Russian girl in her double-breasted gray suit, rattling off idiom after idiom in her own unknowable tongue, which Constantine said was the most difficult part because the Russians didn't have the same idioms as our idioms, and I wished with all my heart I could crawl into her and spend the rest of my life barking out one idiom after another. It mightn't make me any happier, but it would be one more little pebble of efficiency among all the other pebbles. Then Constantine and the Russian girl interpreter and the whole bunch of black and white and yellow men arguing down there behind their labeled microphones seemed to move off at a distance. I saw their mouths going up and down without a sound, as if they were sitting on the deck of a departing ship, stranding me in the middle of a huge silence. I started adding up all the things I couldn't do. I began with cooking. My grandmother and my mother were such good cooks that I left everything to them. They were always trying to teach me one dish or another, but I would just look on and say, yes, yes, I see, while the instructions slid through my head like water, and then I'd always spoil what I did so nobody would ask me to do it again. I remember Jody, my best and only girlfriend at college in my freshman year, making me scrambled eggs at her house one morning. They tasted unusual, and when I asked her if she had put in anything extra, she said cheese and garlic salt. I asked who told her to do that, and she said nobody, she just thought it up. But then, she was practical and a sociology major. I didn't know shorthand either. This meant I couldn't get a good job after college. My mother kept telling me nobody wanted a plain English major. But an English major who knew shorthand was something else again. Everybody would want her. She would be in demand among all the up-and-coming young men, and she would transcribe letter after thrilling letter. The trouble was, I hated the idea of serving men in any way. I wanted to dictate my own thrilling letters. Besides, those little shorthand symbols in the book my mother showed me seemed just as bad as let t equal time and let s equal the total distance. My list grew longer. I was a terrible dancer. I couldn't carry a tune. I had no sense of balance, and when we had to walk down a narrow board with our hands out and a book on our heads in gym class, I always fell over. I couldn't ride a horse or ski, the two things I wanted to do most, because they cost too much money. I couldn't speak German or read Hebrew or write Chinese. I didn't even know where most of the old out-of-the-way countries the UN men in front of me represented fitted in on the map. For the first time in my life, sitting there in the soundproof heart of the UN building between Constantine, who could play tennis as well as simultaneously interpret, and the Russian girl who knew so many idioms, I felt dreadfully inadequate. The trouble was, I had been inadequate all along, I simply hadn't thought about it. The one thing I was good at was winning scholarships and prizes, and that era was coming to an end. I felt like a racehorse in a world without racetracks, or a champion college footballer suddenly confronted by Wall Street in a business suit, his days of glory shrunk to a little gold cup on his mantle with a date engraved on it like the date on a tombstone. I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was EEG, the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death. Just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest, and, as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and, one by one, they plopped to the ground at my feet. Constantine's restaurant smelt of herbs and spices and sour cream. All the time I had been in New York I had never found such a restaurant. I only found those heavenly hamburger places, where they serve giant hamburgers and soup of the day and 4 kinds of fancy cake at a very clean counter facing a long glary mirror. To reach this restaurant we had to climb down 7 dimly lit steps into a sort of cellar. Travel posters plastered the smoke-dark walls, like so many picture windows overlooking Swiss lakes and Japanese mountains and African felts, and thick, dusty bottle candles, that seemed for centuries to have wept their colored waxes red over blue over green, and a fine, 3-dimensional lace, cast a circle of light round each table where the faces floated, flushed and flame-like themselves. I don't know what I ate, but I felt immensely better after the first mouthful. It occurred to me that my vision of the fig tree and all the fat figs that withered and fell to earth might well have arisen from the profound void of an empty stomach. Constantine kept refilling our glasses with a sweet Greek wine that tasted of pine bark, and I found myself telling him how I was going to learn German and go to Europe and be a war correspondent like Maggie Higgins. I felt so fine by the time we came to the yogurt and strawberry jam that I decided I would let Constantine seduce me. Ever since Buddy Willard had told me about that waitress I had been thinking I ought to go out and sleep with somebody myself. Sleeping with Buddy wouldn't count, though, because he would still be one person ahead of me. It would have to be with somebody else. The only boy I ever actually discussed going to bed with was a bitter, hawk-nosed southerner from Yale, who came to college one weekend only to find his date had eloped with a taxi driver the day before. As the girl had lived in my house and I was the only one home that particular night, it was my job to cheer him up. At the local coffee shop, hunched in one of the secretive, high-backed booths with hundreds of people's names gouged into the wood, we drank cup after cup of black coffee and talked frankly about sex. This boy, his name was Eric, said he thought it disgusting the way all the girls at my college stood around on the porches under the lights and